a message today which is follows on from last week's message, and it's entitled Finding Your Crossroads. So if you'll remember last week, we actually did a message entitled Crossroads, and we explained a little bit about that. And we saw historically how God had placed Israel at the crossroads of the then known world. And that there were millions of people who used to travel down the trade routes that ran right the way through Israel, so that Israel would be a light to the Gentile nations as they traveled all around through their little strip of land. And we saw that God placed them right at the crossroads of there so they could influence everybody else and all the nations around them. And at the end, we left ourselves with a question. And the question was, where is your crossroads? What is your crossroads? What is the place that God has placed you to be an influence to those around you? And so I thought I would continue this message, and we'd kind of dig in a little bit deeper, and we'd start having a look at finding your crossroads. Because maybe you answered that straight away. Maybe you thought to yourself, I know exactly where my crossroads is. That's it. This is my place of influence. This is where I get to meet loads of people and interact with them, and I can share my faith with them and all sorts of things like that. But for others, you might have thought, I'm not too sure. I don't know where my crossroads is. Maybe I need to investigate that a little bit further. So that's what we're going to do today, and I'm going to share one of my crossroads with you and hope that you get blessed by it. So, as we think about this question, finding your crossroads, what it is really is it's a question that helps us to think missionally. What do we mean by missionally? Well, it means, do I see myself as somebody who God has sent? Has He sent me to connect with other people? Do I see myself as somebody who He has got in a particular place with a particular group of people so that I can connect with them in meaningful ways and be a blessing to them? Or do I just see myself in life as kind of the same way that I drive my car? Right? You know what it is? You just get in your car and you're just focused on the destination, about where you're going to. You're not really looking around to those that are to the side of you, because let's face it, most people are in your rear view mirror, aren't they? That's the way we drive. All right, focused on the destination and where we're headed. We don't bother to stop at the crossroads and let people pull in from the side road, do we? Let alone let somebody merge in front of us. Never do that. All right, so do we live life as though we see ourselves as people who God has placed on mission and take the time to be with people, to speak to them and influence their lives? Or are we just on this life road where we're just going as fast as we can to get to the destination and we actually miss the journey? And that's what that means. It's what we kind of look at the moment in finding where our crossroads is. So living missionally is less about what you do for Jesus, and it's more about who you are in Jesus. So when you discover who you are in Christ, you're on your way to finding your crossroads. And your crossroads is your missional sweet spot. It's where you just find that everything in your life, everything in your faith, they just kind of all gel together in that sweet spot. How many people here have ever played cricket? Oh, well, you got two people who play cricket. Awesome. All right, so all the Canadians just carry their hands down as low as possible. So all those who are from the other Commonwealth countries, all right, you all know. Okay, how many here have played baseball? All right, that's the other lot played baseball. Right. So if you're either playing cricket or baseball, you know there's a sweet spot on the bat, right? Where when you connect with that ball just at the right angle and it just hits that sweet spot and that ball just goes sailing, right? Well, that's what happens when you find your crossroads. You just sort of hit that sweet spot all right, in your life, in your mission, and everything just gels all at once. And so it's important then that we find where our crossroads is, because that's where it's going to happen for us, right? Do you ever feel like you are a square peg in a round hole? I mean, I guess if there was an antithesis to the sweet spot, it's going to be this, right? You know, we got a square peg and we got a round hole, and it, you know, it just doesn't fit. In fact, we got to hammer that thing really hard to get it in there. Well, that's completely the opposite. And the problem is that lots of us actually, in many areas of our life, feel like we don't fit. We feel like we are square pegs in round holes, and sometimes it feels like we're just getting hammered, right, in order to make us fit. And we all know what that is like and what that feels like. So when we think about our crossroads and where that might be, and finding that sweet spot, finding a crossroads might not be as obvious as you think it is. If you spend 8 hours a day, 5 days a week or more in the office, right, grinding away at whatever it is that you're doing, you may assume then, well, because I'm spending that amount of time in the office, that's obviously where my crossroads is going to be. That's going to be the place where I meet most people. It's where I spend most of my time. That's going to be the place then where God has me, and that's going to be my crossroads, my place of influence. And that isn't necessarily the case, because the place where you work might not be conducive to that. I've worked in a number of offices where if we weren't talking about the task at hand or the project that we were working on, everything else was really frowned upon. All right, so there just wasn't the environment in many of the places that I worked where we were free to talk about the Lord and faith and things like that. So I felt at times in my faith to be a square peg in a round hole. And yet the church was telling me this has got to be the place where you're going to be sharing Jesus with and stuff like that. And I was going, but it just doesn't work sometimes. So it doesn't always fit. So where you are in your station in life might not be exactly where you think it is. So your crossroads might not be obvious. A better place to find your passions and your interests, that's where you're going to find your crossroads. It's a much, much better place to start than necessarily where you spend your workday life. That's not to say that your work life and your workplace isn't your crossroads, but if you find that you don't fit, start to have a look at your passions and your interests as your crossroads, because you'll find that that is where you fit. Now, each one of us are wired differently, right? I think we had a brilliant example of that with Heidi and Weldon up here earlier. All right, one is a door opener and one is a door closer. That's just the way that they're wired. That's the way they are naturally. Okay, I'm not an opener, door opener, or a door closer. I'm a close on the floor kind of guy, and Becky is the picker-upper. But that's just our station in life, right? That's how differently we're wired, and I'm going to get it in the neck when I get home later. All right. All right, but we're all wired differently. All right, we're wired differently, and we all have different passions, different interests, and all that kind of thing. And our interests and our passions we will begin to gravitate towards. And those things that we are passionate about and the things that we have interest in are usually the things that we're good at. Isn't that right? What you're good at, what you enjoy, is usually those things that actually fits your natural wiring, just who you are and the way that you think, the way that you function. It's your sweet spot. So if we begin to look at our passions and our desires, we're far more likely to find our crossroads there. Now, I am wired as an artist, and the visual arts particularly are a passion of mine. That's just how I'm wired. I'm just, as a kid, instead of watching TV, I would be drawing and colouring and all sorts of things like that. And that's just carried on through the rest of my life. So I'm just naturally wired that way. It's how my mind thinks. I think like an artist. I'm predominantly right-brained, all right? A lot of you are predominantly left-brained. Some of you have got both sides of your brain, all right? But for me, I've just got one half, and it's just the right side, which is the artistic side, all right? So I'm wired that way. I can't change that. I can't become something that I'm not any more than you can. So understanding who I am and how I'm wired, and that begins to shape and to form my interests and my passions. And that's where I find my sweet spot. As a Christian artist, I find that God has placed me at the crossroads of influencing people through my art. So as I pursued that passion, as I pursued that interest, as somebody who also is passionate about Jesus, I find the two just kind of gel really well. So I find when I'm talking about art and I'm talking about Jesus, the two just come together, and it's very easy and it comes very naturally. Over the years, I've done lots of different exhibitions. I've done classes. I've done art outreach programs, all sorts of things like that, all connected in around my art. And that's how God's used me. And that's my crossroads. And so what I want to do is I want to share with you one of the recent crossroads encounters that I've had. Back in December, you'll remember that we had Pastor Norman come and share with us. Ray was MC that day. I wasn't here because I was sick. All right, last minute, I couldn't get here. It was coming out of all the wrong ends. So I'll spare you the details. But Pastor Norman, he's a Woodland Creelder. He was visiting his family from British Columbia, and he came and he shared some of his story about himself and and just what happened sort of in our history with the 60s scoop and also the residential schools and stuff like that. So he shared a little bit about that. And on that day, I was going to be sharing with you, as part of my story with that, a painting, which I did. But as I've said, I was taken ill at the last minute. So what I want to do is I actually want to show that to you now. And that's what that thing's behind me is. All right? So I did this painting. And I'll tell you the story of it. In May of 2021, the news came out of the 215 suspected child graves at the Kamloops Residential School. You'll remember that probably. It sent a shockwave out right across Canada and even internationally as well. And as a result of that, many other residential schools and places started to use ground penetrating radar to see if there were any more unmarked graves to find. And lo and behold, we're up over the 1,000 mark now right across Canada. So this is something which is deeply affected not only the Indigenous population, but also the church as well, because the church was very much involved in that story, particularly the church-run residential schools. And so as I heard the story of this unfolding in the news, I had a whole bunch of mixed emotions that were swirling around inside me. I had unbelief was the first one. The first one was kind of like, how could we have ever been complicit in that? How could a church have been involved in something like this, which to our minds now, today, is just so far out there? How could we have done that? Unbelief that this could have gone on for so long. I was saddened, deeply saddened, and just angry, to be perfectly honest with you. There was just a whole bunch of feelings that came along with this news that was coming out. And I just didn't know how to process this. As a pastor, I was confused and angered how the church has been, complicit in all of this. And I realized that as a white pastor who's also an immigrant to Canada, I kind of represent all that's bad, right, in some aspects of our Canadian history when it comes to our Indigenous brothers and sisters. And that's difficult for me. How do I reconcile that? How do I work through that? How do I build bridges, with Indigenous people? I don't know. It's just all these things were just swirling around on the inside of me. I continued to reflect on this particular chapter of our history, our colonial past. And as I was doing that, and conscious of my own past, conscious of the perception of how I am to others, I found that the compulsion of my thoughts and my emotions started to find expression in a piece of artwork. As I was thinking of those things and just processing, I started getting these ideas for artwork, something that I could use to kind of express this stuff that I just couldn't find words for. And that's the beauty of art, is that there are things that you can say and express through art that we just don't find words for. And I'm not a poet. I'm not gifted in being a wordsmith. So I can't finely craft, these feelings in ways that move people. I do it through art because that's the way God's wired me. So I began to filter these things through my artistic capabilities. And I came up with the end result, which was this painting here. And I want to explain it to you. The Every Child Matters movement that we should all be familiar with nowadays is a movement where they have begun to use the colour orange to represent Every Child Matters. And so I took that element of Every Child Matters, the orange, and I placed it as the background, the very groundwork of the canvas itself. So it became something that was embedded in the entire piece. And that is directly on the canvas and unifies the whole piece. Another aspect of the canvas here was, as I was thinking through it and just mulling over how am I going to represent this, how am I going to work through this, and just going through that process with me, I wanted to incorporate an earth tone because these were graves. These were places where, whether they were marked at one point, they'd become unmarked now. We don't know what's down there yet. That's still all to be discovered. But nonetheless, they have found remains of children that have been buried in unmarked graves. And I wanted to use an earth tone, an earth colour to represent that part of our land, that part which the Indigenous people very much connect with is the land, and also that place of their final resting place. And as I did that, the idea came to me, wouldn't it be great if I could create an ochre, a paint, using the earth from the grave sites itself? So there's a direct connection in the painting itself with the place of Kamloops and where the graves are. I thought it was a brilliant idea. The problem was Kamloops in British Columbia and I'm in Ottawa. How on earth am I going to go over there and get some earth? So I it just kind of left it for a while as I continued to mull it over. And then several months later, as all this was still very much in the conception sort of phases, I received a phone call out of the blue from somebody who I had never met before and never spoken to before. And it was Pastor Norman. He was saying that he was coming over from British Columbia to visit his daughter who lives here in Manotick, and he wanted to come to one of our Christmas services. And so that summer, I invited him to that winter, Christmas, I invited him. It's Christmas is summer in Australia. That's why I get confused. All right. So anyway, side point. So anyway, that Christmas, I asked him to come, and he did the welcome to land, the land acknowledgement for us. So I began to build a relationship with Pastor Norman, and of course, then he told me that he's actually living in Kamloops. Well, again, he came then in the early spring. I get an email from him, and he said that the church that he belongs to in Kamloops is putting on an event called Us Together. And this event was they were going to have mostly Indigenous voices coming and sharing the gospel and how the gospel has transformed their lives, their families' lives, and the communities around them. And we would be able to hear some of the stories of their survival of residential school, some of their stories about what it was like being part of the 60s scoop, where planes would fly into Indigenous communities, grab children, and whisk them out of there so that they could populate the quotas for the residential schools. And so we had people from northern Saskatchewan as well as the places around Kamloops all come to this event, which they shared with us. And it was one of the most amazing events to be able to listen to the stories of these people and just see how the gospel has changed their lives for the better. It was just amazing. But it also gave me the opportunity to travel to Kamloops so that I could get some dirt. So you see, God, I just love the way that God, even in my unspoken desires, makes a way. And so when I was there, I got permission to take some dirt. Now, the actual residential school site, I wasn't actually able to get into where they have the graveyards because the actual area, the orchard where the graveyards are, is all cordoned off because it's a sacred site, and of course it's now an investigation site as well. So they've got it all cordoned off. But I got permission to take some soil from an adjacent part next to where the cordoned off site was. So the residential school itself owns the 300 acres that surround all the way around. So it's still from the land that the residential school is on. So I managed to get my soil. Getting it through customs was another thing, but that's a story for another time. But anyway, I managed to bring some back. And what I did was when I got home, I dried it out, and then using a pestle and mortar in the old-fashioned way, the way that we used to make paint before we could go down to Michael's and get it, right, in tube form. We just ground it up in a pestle and mortar, and then I added acrylic resin to that as a binder. And then that was poured on, and that's what this dark groundwork is here. So we've actually, in the painting itself, that colour is the colour from the Kamloops Indian Residential School earth, and contains that same earth which so many of those kids would have played on and all that sort of stuff. So that completes the groundwork for the piece itself. Now you'll have a look at it from where you're sitting and you'll just see what probably looks like just a big white square, right? So what's artistic about that? Well, the groundwork, that white, big, imposing white mass, which is really the effect that I was trying to go for, is this idea of white colonial British rule, right? And as a Brit, I can say these things without being culturally inappropriate, right? So it's this white colonialism that came to Canada and just imposed colonial rule straight over the top of Canada, the Indigenous peoples of this land, and imposed itself over the top of these things. And that was the idea behind having this large white square that's just imposed over everything. And the way that I did this is I used a crackle paste medium so that it went on quite thick. And what happens with a crackle paste medium is as it dries, it begins to crack. So you can see what's underneath. You can see the colour that begins to come through. So if you come and have a look at the painting later, you'll see that the whole of that white ground effect there is just full of cracks. And what that represents is, as today we look back on our colonial past and we begin to question some of the things that we did, some of the values that we held, and some of the things that, we maybe just turned a blind eye to. By and large, we're beginning to see that colonialism begin to crack, begin to fracture, and begin to break apart as we begin to reevaluate who we are as Canadians in the 21st century, living in the land with Indigenous people that have had to suffer so much from the values of our past. And so this white mass is beginning to crack up, and as it does, and those cracks begin to form, you can once again begin to see behind to what's been underneath all the time. The symbol in Indigenous culture for truth is an eagle feather. And they will use this when they have treaties. They will use an eagle feather when they have parleys with different groups, and they're trying to establish something or make up. And so they will use an eagle feather as a token for truth. And what I did is I wanted to mark 215 graves on this painting, which I've done. And each one of those marks goes down through the white groundwork, back down to the ground itself, was made with an eagle feather. And this again is another time that God provided, because where am I going to get an eagle feather in Manatik from? We don't have that many flying around. And so again, a time went by and I had this unspoken desire for an eagle feather. God answered my prayer. And so my daughter last summer, went away camping in Algonquin Park. And she was camping for a week on one of the islands, canoe camping. And she came back and she brought back 2 eagle feathers, which just happened to be in the campsite where she was. And so I was able to say, oh, this is amazing, God. So I used one of those feathers to make 215 marks in this canvas. And I'm going to mount that on the back of the painting. So again, God will use your desire, use your passions, use those things that are just inside of you, and he'll use them for his kingdom, and he'll connect you with kingdom work if you're open to it. Now you'll have a look as you can see probably from the back here that these marks are arranged in a 4-square pattern. This 4-square pattern is both a sign of lament and a sign of hope. The lament is the cross that appears in the negative space between the 4 areas. So if you haven't seen it already, I think I can use that. This is the negative space that exists between these 4 areas here. And so as you begin to see that, you can see the cross. And because, again, this is Christians complying in some very negative ways, that cross, as is often seen by Indigenous folk, as actually being something negative. It's something which is a stumbling block to them, because it also represents something which would have caused them and their families a great deal of pain, and becomes a stumbling block for many to actually come to know Christ because of that. So the cross is here embedded in the negative space, but the empty cross is also a symbol of hope. It's the greatest and most powerful symbol that we have as Christians of the resurrection, a new hope and a new beginning. In Christian art history, you'll often find things arranged in a 4-square pattern because it represents the 4 Gospels. And so I've arranged these grave sites, if you like, in this 4-square pattern as well to represent the gospel, because the gospel is our hope. It's the hope for our Indigenous brothers and sisters. It's our hope as well. It's a hope that together, as we begin to work together and reconcile together and work for truth and reconciliation, that the gospel itself will begin to work its work. That Christ will be made known amongst our Indigenous people, be made known in the church in a new way, and we can begin to write a new chapter. A new chapter in Canada's history. One which isn't marred by the pain of the past, but one that we can see through the gospel of Jesus and through the cross of Christ that he is our healer. He is the one that brings us all together so that there's neither white Canadian, black Canadian, yellow Canadian, red Canadian, but we're all one in Jesus Christ. We can begin to write a new chapter. So it's both a symbol of lament as well as a symbol of hope. Despite the shame of our recent church history, Paul writes, I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of salvation for all who believe. Now, I've heard the testimonies of our Indigenous brothers and sisters. I've heard the testimonies of how they are grateful and thankful that the gospel came to these shores and how Christ was introduced to them and how it has changed their personal lives, their families' lives, and the communities in which they live have been completely changed around. And it is just amazing, particularly when you hear the stories of pain next to the stories of salvation and how God has completely redeemed them. It does something inside of you. When I was in Kamloops and I listened to these beautiful testimonies, I was having the gospel preached to me. And it's like I was hearing it fresh for the first time. And I've been a Christian for over 35 years and I'm a pastor. And yet I listened with fresh ears and I saw the beauty that the gospel is and the hope that there is within the gospel. You know, as First Nations and Second Nations Church begin to embrace our ministry of reconciliation together, there's light and there's hope for this land, that Jesus will wipe away every tear and turn that lament, that mourning, into joy. And that's my hope. That's my hope. So as I'm passionate about these things, as part of all of this that's kind of happened, as we move into this year, I've just begun to reach out to a number of Indigenous leaders and a number of church leaders so that we also can have an Us Together event where we will hear the stories of gospel. We'll hear the stories how Jesus has changed things in the lives of our Indigenous people, both from the local Indigenous people, but also from our Inuit brothers and sisters. Did you know that Ottawa has the largest Inuit population outside of Nunavut? Because they all come here, because this is the National Capital Region. We are uniquely placed, I'm starting to preach now, we are uniquely placed in Ottawa to reach our brothers and sisters, the First Nations people. Because this is the National Capital Region, they all send their delegates here. There's representations of all the different tribes, the Métis people and the First Nations people, the Inuit people, all across Canada. They all come here. So we can hold an event which will tell the story of reconciliation, tell the story of the gospel and how it transforms lives and how the church and the Indigenous church are coming together here in Canada. We have an opportunity to begin to write a new story. Because there's no blueprint for truth and reconciliation. There's no how-to. We just simply have to try. And that's what, God willing, we'll be doing at the end of this year. Matthew 5:14-16 says, "You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." Living missionally is less to do with what you do for Jesus and more to do with who you are in Jesus. When your faith and your passions begin to intersect, you will come alive. You'll find something stirring on the inside of you that you just can't hold back. You know, as one of the writers said, it's like fire shut up in my bones. How are you going to get it out? That's what happens when faith and passion begins to ignite on the inside of you. And when that happens, that's where you're going to find your crossroads. That's where you're going to find the place where you can live missionally. That's the place where you're going to find your sweet spot where everything just gels together. We got a bunch of guys here that have a passion for motorcycles, and they belong to a Christian motorcycle club. Well, they're passionate about motorcycles. Well, what happens when their faith and their passion join together? They find their crossroads. They find their place of mission. They find their place of outreach to those who are far from Jesus. We got people here who are entrepreneurs, and they find that their passion is in business and starting up just business startups and things like that, and creating opportunities for people to come and work in a Christian environment. That's their passion. Because their faith and their passion join together. That's great, because they actually get to spend 24/7 in their crossroads, because that's how hard it is to be an entrepreneur. It's not 8 hours a day, is it? It's 24/7, right? But it doesn't matter what your passion is. Your passion might be hockey. It might be a sport. It could be anything. It doesn't matter what it is. But when your faith and your passion are united and they intersect, that is your crossroads. We're going to start looking deeper into these things next month when we have our Spiritual Gift Discovery Day. So this is just a foretaste. So make sure you come along, all right? I won't get a show of hands right now.